I'm Howie Lim. This is Money Hacks by the Business Times.
Imagine a sudden loss of income. Could you survive for 6 months? If the answer makes you nervous, you're not alone. Apparently, 61% of households here in Singapore say they're at their breaking point. We're looking at the hard data behind our current financial confidence crisis and asking the questions that matter. When budgets are tight, what's the first sacrifice we make? And is it secretly destroying our long-term health? What are the early warning signs you need to know to move from simply coping to building resilience? Welcome to Money Hacks. I'm Howie Lim, and we're getting expert help from financial psychologist Dr Annabelle Chow. Doc, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, it's really distressing. One's suddenly lost their job. When the initial shock hits, though, what's the single most common financial mistake people make that you've seen in the first 48 hours that really tends to haunt them later?
The biggest mistake is making a permanent financial decision when our nervous system is still in threat mode. So when retrenchment happens, our brain often reads it as danger. So it's not just information because it actually puts our identity in question. It also often is a family system event. So it's not just a financial event that affects us. So that urgency is understandable, but at the same time, that urgency is not the same as wisdom. So often I think we would respond according to the urgency and say, I must do something now. And from a psychological standpoint, that is when we are the most vulnerable to short-term relief behaviors. So for example, we might cash out long-term assets, we might take a high-interest loan, or most commonly, we might actually end up hiding the news from a spouse because oftentimes the shame might feel quite unbearable. So I would recommend that for the first financial move, it's actually a regulation move. Slow ourselves down, hit the pause, breathe, so that we can see the facts, see what cash is available to us, what needs to be paid out in the next 30 days, and who needs to be informed early. So it's only when we slow down that we can actually start to make decisions that are a bit more logically informed than emotionally driven.
Does it mean we should only make decisions on the 49th hour, or how long should we wait to calm down, so to speak?
I think the actual calming down is probably not measured by duration per se because it could be different for all of us, and it also really depends on what we are doing to calm down. So to some extent, it's objective where you need to actually be doing something to calm down. For example, you need to be breathing, you need to be regulating your stress levels. Ideally, you should be telling someone who is important, whom you trust, so that you can have discussions together. Separate to that, it's also important to actually look at your finances, right? Look at what your payments are, what loans you have, what needs to be adjusted in terms of like lifestyle and decisions. But you can only really do that when you are actually calm, collected, and in a logical/wise mind mode, where you can actually apply both logical and emotional brain. So if we are not doing any of those and we're kind of spiraling in our own darkness, then it doesn't really quite matter if we have like 49 hours or more. We might actually end up being more anxious, and that can actually affect our decision-making process.
Tough times right now, though, Doc. So this 3 to 6 months emergency fund, that's starting to look challenging to maintain. But what about for the mid-career professionals who maybe have a lot of obligations? They've got the family, they have the mortgage, they have the maybe car payments and such. Maybe we should start rethinking how much emergency fund there should be.
I agree with you completely. So for mid-career professionals, I'm also of the opinion that 3 months may feel really thin, especially when you're supporting children, a mortgage, school fees, healthcare needs, or oftentimes elderly parents or grandparents. So the psychological function of this runway is not actually just to pay bills, it's really to reduce threat that our brain has registered. It gives us certainty, it gives us safety, it gives us the know-how, like we have something to fall back on. So when this runway becomes really short, like 3 months, our mind becomes narrowed by fear. And again, it becomes emotion driven. And we might actually start to accept poor fit roles or make hurried financial decisions just to reduce our anxiety. So I wonder whether a more realistic standard for today might be like 12, maybe 9 to 12 months of essential expenses. So I'm not referring to full lifestyle spending, but survival type of commitments like mortgage, like food, transport, insurance, household essentials, essential expenses.
Those would be really untouchable, right? You reckon? Because once
Absolutely.
the bank balance starts to shrink, you start to panic and you want to just cut everything, and you might just think of essentials as not so essential. What should
Mm.
really be untouchable beyond the ones that you've just mentioned?
I think it's not really so much completely untouchable. Psychologically, like they should not be treated in the first place with that mindset. So when our bank balance starts shrinking, we naturally look for the immediate relief. So that's a really normal human response. But the relief can also become very risky if it removes the very protection that we need during a vulnerable time. But perhaps I might frame this as a more like values and protection question. So maybe have a think about, what is this payment protecting? Is it protecting our health, our future security, or actually maintaining a lifestyle pattern that needs or can be paused? So the first layer of this review might be our discretionary spending. Look at our holiday spending, our daily habits, or even like a really quiet one that probably eats away at our savings without us really noticing: subscriptions. So I think that's actually a common one where we may not actually be putting a lot of our mind to it. But if you kind of add up your subscriptions monthly, you might actually be surprised how much that actually takes up of your monthly expenditure. So after that, like review our insurance and our retirement contributions carefully, but not impulsively. So what I would say is really just to review, but do not panic cancel, because there are options like reducing coverage or, changing payment frequency, pausing our voluntary contributions. But definitely, I would recommend discussing this with either a trusted financial advisor or a family member, so that you are not making emotional decisions only.
Some of us are so tied into what we do, our identities. I'm a doctor, I'm a journalist, and it's been that way for decades. And suddenly we've lost our jobs. How do we separate, so to speak, our sense of self-worth from the paycheck, from the title, and sort of calm down again to be able to make objective
Hmm.
financial decisions?
To be honest, I am actually not sure that it's completely possible to separate our identity from work, because that's kind of how much time we've invested in our life. And if you spend that much time building a career or like providing for others and being known for a role, like example being a doctor or a journalist, I think it's very difficult to separate or decouple that from our identity. That loss can be very significant and will hurt. So, from an acceptance and commitment therapy standpoint, the aim is not to pretend that the pain is not there. The aim is actually to make room for the pain without letting it drive our decision. In acceptance and commitment therapy, in short, we call it ACT, we separate pain from suffering. Pain is adaptable. Pain is necessary. And when something like that, like a retrenchment happens, pain is natural. But then oftentimes we might end up adding on what I call suffering. So that is when we don't accept that that has happened. We are in denial, or we might make decisions that are really unwise and be in an opposite decision as to accepting that it has happened and to learn to make plans around that. That suffering can oftentimes make our losses more significant. We can end up being more emotional. So one part of the person might know that retrenchment reflects our market conditions or it's a company decision. But another part, often we might feel ashamed, we might feel, of course, frightened and rejected, and they all can be true. So instead of saying to ourselves that this should not affect my self worth, maybe we can try to tell ourselves that this has affected me. It is what it is. And I can still choose my next step according to my values, according to what's important to me. This is really important because often we might get fused with the story like, I'm no longer successful, I'm no longer necessary, Was I not helpful or did I not contribute? Because of this story that they tell themselves, they'll end up reacting in a way that's consistent with that story. So often a useful value-based question would be, if I'm acting from a perspective of responsibility and steadiness rather than shame, what could I do next? What's the next step that I can take?
We've been speaking about what to do when you're retrenched, especially in terms of your finances, with Dr. Annabelle Chow. More in a moment.
Market Focus Weekly, now hosted by Howie Lim. A sharp weekly deep dive into what's moving markets in Singapore and across the region, with analysts and market insiders to break down the forces shaping the week ahead. New episodes every Friday, powered by the journalism of the Business Times. Find Market Focus Weekly wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, back to Money Hacks from the Business Times.
Welcome back. Doc, speaking of next steps, it's rather difficult in today's context where the career path is no longer linear. Let's say it's a mid-career professional. They've lost their jobs and they have to pivot maybe into a new industry. What can they do to sort of safeguard their wealth reserves whilst they find a new job, possibly in a new industry?
I like to think of a career pivot like an investment plan, but not an emotional escape plan. So after retrenchment, naturally, we may want a clean break, right? And because the shame, and if the industry is small, we might be driven by the shame and say, I want to leave this entire industry and I don't want people to know and I don't want to be part of this. But maybe the first step, besides pausing and breathing, is to clarify the function of this pivot. Is it firstly a strategic move? For example, is the industry genuinely shrinking? In some industries, AI is overtaking the entire industry, and that is causing a lot of panic, that's causing a lot of jobs to be lost. Or is it mainly to escape shame or panic? So that can help us kind of determine the next step. Then, of course, we still need to calculate the true cost. So time to qualify, possible income change or income dip, time to secure that role in a very real way would affect our household expenses during the transition. Having very honest, open conversations with family members will also be quite important. Retrenchment is a family event. It's not just a personal financial event. Psychologically, like a stage experiment can help because it lowers that all or nothing pressure. So not like I'm immediately leaving into a different industry, but perhaps just considering like a short course or speaking to people in that target industry or trying some contract positions or small paid assignments that can be helpful to inform us, drawing from our existing strengths in line with our values, and that is a strategic move for us.
A lot's been said about this 3-bucket approach to finances. So in the heat of a layoff, though, which bucket gets prioritized first? Like, which one should you hang on to and which one should you let go of first, so to speak? And at what point does the long-term bucket become fair game?
The 3-bucket approach is helpful because it gives our mind structure. And our mind thrives on structure and organization because it provides certainty, especially when the rug has been pulled from under us. So in a layoff, the first bucket is immediate safety. So that covers things like housing, food, utilities, transport, medical needs, children's needs, insurance. Psychologically, this bucket tells our nervous system that we can get through the next stretch. The second bucket is the transition bucket. So it supports the period between jobs, right? So you're talking about like career coaching, temporary income gaps, or job search costs. Retraining often might be necessary. So that protects our momentum so that we don't become frozen by fear. Again, psychologically, what happens here is when we are doing something, it gives us the confidence that it's goal-oriented. We are getting somewhere. And many times, just that act helps to reduce our anxiety and our uncertainty. The third bucket would be the long-term bucket, things like our retirement savings, our long-term investments, assets meant for future security. And while this bucket should be protected as far as possible because it represents our future safety, it also becomes quite fair game because if our debt becomes dangerous or our essentials cannot be met, then we will probably have to think about a planned sacrifice of this bucket. So I think the important principle here is planned sacrifice and not panic sacrifice. So we cannot function based on what can I sell quickly, but perhaps we can ask ourselves, what choice protects the household now while causing the least long-term harm?
Doc, I've heard you say, have the conversation with your family, have the conversation with your family. How to have that conversation? Because it's embarrassing. You're probably really hurt too. How do we, without also making them panic and afraid like we are?
With openness and honesty. So I think the key here is containment. The first recommendation is not to pretend that everything is fine, but also to communicate in a way that does not make the other person carry or panic. So with a spouse, I think very importantly, you have to tell them early, but also before you tell them, take some time to just steady yourself. When there's secrecy, it usually protects our shame in a short term, but over time, that shame becomes deeper and bigger. And then that would increase mistrust and anxiety at home if our spouse finds out before we tell them. So I will use a very simple structure. For example, I will talk about facts, I'll talk about feelings, and I'll talk about the next concrete steps. So this has happened. I have been retrenched. I'm still processing it. I would like us to look at the numbers together. We don't have the answers and we don't need to solve everything today, but let's face it as a team. So this kind of language gives the relationship a holding frame. I've worked with couples where actually in times of crisis, for example, they can deepen their relationship and become stronger as a team. But there are also couples who break down when they are in face of a crisis. And I think a very big difference that I've observed is whether the relationship has a holding frame, whether it has trust, whether it has security, and whether communication is open and honest. So with families with kids, I think we need to keep it age appropriate. I don't think kids need to know the full financial details, but kids need to have calm and simple information. So for example, for a young child, I might say, mommy or daddy is changing jobs, so I might be at home for a while. We may have to be more careful with our spending. We might have to think about doing something different for the upcoming school holidays, but you're safe, we will take care of you, you'll be all right. So you want to try to protect the routines as much as possible. Things like meals, bedtime, family time, these are routines, but they're actually not small things because they are signs of safety. So most importantly, do not use our children as an emotional support. So it's all right to let them know that some things have changed, but they should never feel responsible for comforting us or solving our problems.
When do you tell them though? How old?
Again, the way that I think about it is not really the chronological number, but what you really want to assess is the maturity. So for example, I have an 8 and 6-year-old, and because I have been using adult language and I usually communicate with them via reasoning and explanation, I'm confident and comfortable to explain to them concepts of world current events, the war, any kind of like electricity tariffs, these concepts. I explain it to them in simpler language. But in the same vein, I have friends telling me, oh, my 8-year-old is not going to understand that. And that's all right because every child develops differently and everyone has a different way of communication at home. So I think that litmus test here is really to establish how has your child actually responded to you when there's been crisis? How do you actually communicate with them? And then use that to assess how you communicate this big news to them. So you still can, it's just that you might have to adjust your language accordingly.
What's one small, manageable financial win someone can achieve in their first week of retrenchment to sort of reclaim that sense of agency and control?
Perhaps create a 30-day survival budget. That's not just a budgeting exercise, it's actually a behavioral activation exercise. So because retrenchment can create this helplessness and mental fog, I think the first win needs to be small enough for us to complete. So start by just listing down what needs to be paid in the next 30 days, then separate, most importantly, what our needs and wants are. So needs are expenses that protect safety and basic stability. Wants are expenses that can be paused or delayed or even reduced. Then take one practical action. Pause a non-essential subscription, set a weekly spending limit, or maybe start to look up for information about potential lenders or review an upcoming large payment before it becomes urgent. So the psychological message here is I'm not powerless. I do not have to solve my entire future today, but I can just take the next workable steps. And as we write everything on a piece of paper, we are also organizing the chaos in our brain, and we are transferring that into something tangible and organized that we can see, and that often soothes our anxiety.
Thank you so much for your insights today.
You're most welcome.
Financial psychologist Dr. Annabelle Chow. This has been Money Hacks by the Business Times. I'm Howie Lim.
This is a podcast by the Business Times. Find more BT podcasts at businesstimes.com.sg/podcasts. Or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is meant to provide general information only. SPH Media accepts no liability for loss arising from any reliance on the podcast or use of third parties' products and services. Please consult professional advisors for independent advice.